And today, it's 11:15, so we're gonna get started because I know there's people in Zoom too, so I'm gonna turn it over to Erin.
Great, thanks everyone for coming. Before we get started, I'm hosting a potluck tonight. The address is in that email that went out if you want to give you an email. It is like a very small residential street, so strategically parked, please not in front of my neighbor's driveways. I'm also new to the neighborhood, so if they're mad at me because we're but kind of on the loop around there, there are plenty of places to find. At around 6, there will be vegetarian food. All right. I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Neil Carter for our speaker this week. He's an associate professor at the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University. He received degrees from UC San Diego, University of Michigan, and Michigan State University, and completed a postdoc with the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. I can tell you about all these cool papers. He's got it on the top journals on tree and PNS, science, on and on. He's also gotten some really cool grants from NASA. I encourage you to ask him about. Very cool stuff. I first met Neil at a conference when I was a grad student, and through extreme luck have been in some of the same circles going on as a grad student and through my career. So I'm really excited that we were able to get him to come and visit us and give our seminar today. Thank you.
Okay, how many of you, this is your first in-person seminar in a while? Yeah, it feels so nice. Seeing people on 3 dimensions, I won't take it for granted. Huge honor to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. And this is an honor for a number of different reasons. First, this is 30 degrees warmer here than when it feels so good. The sun feels good. My vitamin D deficiency is slowly erasing. Also, as I've been probably telling everyone that I meet practically, I have a 3-month-old son. And while that is fantastic, and I'm extremely grateful and happy about it, I have not left a 2-block radius around my house in 3 months. So this is my first time getting out and being a normal human and talking about science. But thirdly, and probably the most important, is that I love these opportunities to share some of my ideas with top scholars, emerging leaders in these fields, share some of my ideas, but most importantly for me to learn from all of you and hopefully help modify my own perspectives and ideas and kind of jointly build these ideas together. So I'm really hopeful that we can have some time after the seminar to talk about some of these ideas. And today I'm going to talk about coexistence. This is an area that I have been fascinated with for years. It's fuzzy, it's soft around the edges, it's unclear what we actually need. And that's what I want to try to tackle, try to better understand what this is. So there aren't any regression lines in my presentation. There aren't any p-values. I'm sure I can dredge some up somewhere if you wanted to look at p-values. Do that. Really, I'm talking big picture about the challenges and what are some potential big ideas conceptually to help us move towards coexistence approach, mindset, and ways to reach successful outcomes for coexistence. First, buttons aren't really anything. I'm going to start a little backwards today. I'm going to start with the take-home thoughts. I have a couple reasons for this. First reason is that I'm hopeful I can give you some ideas, just 3 take-home thoughts that you can sort of marinate with throughout the talk. And probably most pragmatically, that after the first minute, if you are completely, totally, utterly bored, you can check out, and I know that you've gotten the 3 key things that I want you to get. So the first take-home thought message is that outcomes of human-wildlife interactions, I believe, have shared properties and comprise archetypes, meaning that they're not all so idiosyncratic that we can't actually find some similarities between them and use those similarities to help us measure and understand their progress. The second takeaway is that these archetypes can be resilient. They don't want to change, they're sticky. And importantly, resilience is not synonymous with coexistence. This is oftentimes misunderstood, and this happens in the sustainability literature all the time. Resilience good, right? You can have resilient dictatorships. You can have resilient levels of conflict. We want to avoid those. We're seeking resilient coexistence, which leads to the third point here, that resilient coexistence is hard. There's a reason that we don't see it all that often. That when you ask somebody for an example, they usually go, because we need active governance structures to promote coexistence outcomes. And if we're going to promote those outcomes, we need to know what coexistence is, and we need to know what those outcomes are compared against. And I don't think we really quite have that yet. So finding that resilient coexistence is it's hard to come by. It's more the exception than the norm. And I've been interested in this idea of shared lands and coexistence my entire adult life. I'm so interested in these places where on one hand, you can have animals that pose these tremendous risks to human well-being, threats to safety, livelihoods, human-caused mortality of wildlife, and can oftentimes be higher in these shared lands. On the other hand, in some of these shared lands, wildlife can actually have enhanced fitness. They can even do better than their wildland counterparts. And people's their lives can be profoundly enriched through these experiences and interactions with wildlife. So I'm interested in the latter. I want to know how we get those positive, desirable outcomes from the point of view of conservation. Has everyone seen this leopard photo? Oh, it's so amazing. This photographer, Steve Winter, has all these just unreal photos. Cougars in Hollywood and all that thing. And I also think that this issue of coexistence is urgent. It's really timely. Because we're not talking about a few little spots on the land. This is a map produced a few years ago from Earl Ellis in University of Maryland. And what we can see here, the takeaway is that over half of the Earth's terrestrial surface is, according to them, shared lands, places where people and wildlife are commingling on these mosaics. And if that's the case, that means there's huge opportunities for conservation to figure out coexistence. Protected areas are wonderful and they can be extremely successful. But when we talk about the real breadth of the globe, we're really looking at a lot of places where we don't have those kinds of strict protections in place, but we have to figure out what to do there. And it's actually most of the globe are these shared lands. And scientists are starting to turn more and more of their attention to this topic of coexistence specifically. So this is a paper a couple years ago, reviewed the literature and looked at how many times people use the word coexistence, what species were they referring to, and you can see that not only the volume of papers that refer to coexistence increased, but also the proportion of papers that are talking about coexistence are increasing. So that's exciting, because we're seeing more of the research community turning toward that topic, trying to struggle with it. And this just broke down those papers by species, and not surprisingly, most of it is dominated by gray wolves, such a fully named contentious species, lots of efforts to try to understand coexistence with those. But we also see examples from all over the world: leopards, pumas, tigers, cheetahs. And this is just, some of the big iconic large carnivores. But there's a lot of other work being done with other taxa, trying to figure out coexistence. But despite the interest in coexistence, I challenge you to come up with a definition right now that we all said, oh, that's coexistence. It's super elusive. It's really soft. It's very vague. And I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. One of which I think is different disciplines come to this topic with totally different theoretical and conceptual frameworks. So when I work with social psychologists and I talk about coexistence, they talk about tolerance, human tolerance to wildlife. What are the factors that drive tolerance? What are the cognitions and emotions and the things that kind of form those worldviews? They're not thinking at all about the wildlife component of it. My background's in behavioral ecology and wildlife ecology, and in our community, we tend to think about coexistence about, well, what's the demographic consequences, the behavioral impacts to wildlife in these shared lands, and how does that impact the ability for these animals to persist on the landscape? But you're probably thinking that, like, basically by definition, when you have co in there, whatever the word is co, that we're really talking about something that should be spanning human and wildlife dimensions, probably equally. So there's a huge opportunity to establish a concept of coexistence that's clear, more consistent, and more comprehensive, that does a better job at spanning these different dimensions, so that we can better address and monitor and measure this concept. And my hope is that by doing that, we would move away from thinking of coexistence as a rhetorical device, something that the media might use to say, harmonious coexistence. Yeah, but what does that mean? There's something that actually is measurable, is subject to scientific measurement. There's benchmarks, there could be targets, and we can actually have those things be shared in different places and see what the progress is towards coexistence outcomes. That's my hope in this. So much of my perspectives on coexistence emerged from my PhD research, and I'm sure many of you in your graduate work, you're just, the flow of new ideas is just coming in at a rapid pace, and you're learning and coming up with new ideas, which is what this period of time is all about. So my whole worldview went through a big change during my PhD. I was doing work on tiger conservation in Chitwan National Park in Nepal. Famous place, lots and lots of tigers still there, just packed full of tigers. And if you were to look out into these lowlands, it might look something like this. So very famous riverine forests, huge grasslands, supports tigers, rhinos, huge numbers of prey species. Just really extremely biodiverse. If you turn north and face north, it looks like this. You have really extensive agricultural lands. You have fairly populated areas, villages, not high population densities, but ubiquitous human presence. So this particular park, which is only 1,000 square kilometers, there's about 500,000 people that live within 5 kilometers of the park. And approximately 3/4 of them depend on the forests for their livelihoods. Literally, they go in every day, collect reeds, firewood, other medicinal products from the forest. And so they're interacting with these species all the time. So what I wanted to do when I got there is as I realized, it's like, how are they living side by side at all? How do they have that many tigers in this small of a place, this many people that go into the forest every day and not have it be an absolute catastrophe every single day? It isn't. It actually is. It actually works relatively well on the cluster's conflict. So I wanted to learn about what is it that's happening there that's enabling them to live side by side, and whether or not those insights could be shared to other places where we share lands with wildlife, potentially risky wildlife. And if you want to have a humbling experience, condense your entire dissertation into one figure, which is basically this. Don't even bother reading my dissertation. I mean, you can if you want. I think my mom does. But you can just look at this and you'll basically get everything you need to get out of it. And what it started to kind of come into my mind is that this system, you can't break it up. You can't reduce it into this little constituent parts. They're fundamentally entwined. The human subsystem, the socioeconomics, the demographics, the behaviors, it is fundamentally intertwined with the tiger subsystem, the prey, and the tiger behavior in its habitat is fundamentally influencing the human subsystem. Those couplings, those relationships, you can't break them apart. They're just part and parcel of this connected social ecological system. The other thing that came to my mind as I worked there is that it also isn't static. There's a tendency to think that a place like this, they have lived with tigers doing the exact same thing, the exact same way for a time immemorial. And it couldn't be further from the truth. Both tigers and people are constantly adjusting their behaviors with respect to each other. Their behaviors, they're kind of adapting and trying to do different things in order to maximize their interests. For example, institutions. One of the big changes that happened in Nepal, as an example of a human adaptation that really changed the opportunities for tigers and tiger prey, was the implementation of community forests. So in the mid-90s, the government of Nepal realized they were failing their forests at a central level. They centrally were not able to manage Nepal's forests very well. So they evolved the management authority to local communities. It's very risky, because if it failed, it would be massive across the whole country. By and large, the evidence suggests it has been successful. And in our particular area, Chitwan National Park, we found that after the community forests were implemented, giving those management responsibilities to communities, using empirical data, where tigers were, camera traps, all kinds of fun stuff, habitat quality had demonstrably improved outside the national park in the remaining forests that were managed by those communities. Whereas inside the park, the habitat had been gradually decreasing. But the takeaway is that this was an adaptation. This was people changing their behaviors for a range of interests, one of which included biodiversity. They wanted to enhance biodiversity in the local forests. And this is the solution they came up with. And this was having an impact on the environment and the habitat for tigers, which is the focal species for me. And of course, tigers are also adapting. That was one of the really interesting things to see here, is that they're doing things to sort of avoid people and access prey. So here we're looking at temporal activity of tigers and people. And this is the 24-hour period on the bottom right. And the overlap, the temporal activity is important. And you can see that inside the park, this restricted, protected area, there's lots of human activity. Some of it local, some of it patrol, some of it tourist. All of it's during the day, and there's a little bit of overlap. Tigers are active during the day, but they're more active at dawn and dusk at nighttime. There's some overlap. If they go outside the park, they were completely inactive during the day. They had gone completely nocturnal. The only difference between these two places, side by side, is that the areas outside the park were managed by communities. So people there go into the forest on foot, collect forest products, and come out. They're going in there every single day. Pretty large numbers of people compared to inside the park. We contend that tigers were adapting their temporal activities to avoid that disturbance during the day, but we're still using the forest because there was abundant prey. So they're just hunting mostly at night, trying to get access to that prey. They haven't given up, let's say, on those forests and are only staying inside the park. So my colleague John Linnell and I synthesized some of these ideas about interactions, and John Linnell works all over the world. He's in Norway and thinks a lot about the European context. And we started to think about these as mutual adaptation between people and wildlife, constantly adjusting and moving, co-adaptations. And the way we define it, not an evolutionary perspective per se, but we defined it as humans and wildlife changing their behavior, learning from experience, and pursuing their own interests with respect to each other. So keep that in mind, because I use this idea of co-adaptation to think a little bit more about coexistence. So with that definition, you could probably think, well, okay, we've been co-adapting with wildlife forever. And that's true, that's right. And oftentimes the way that we've looked at it is the ways that we've adapted ways to more efficiently kill risky wildlife. We have new tools, new ways to lethally remove or lethally deter animals that pose a risk to us. We know all about those. There's a lot of research on conflict. But we also, of course, are adapting ways, changing our behaviors that are non-lethal. So example here with Aaron is super familiar with, using beehives as a strategy, non-lethal strategy, deterring elephants from crops instead of poisoning them. Even protective policies, I think, are a form of an adaptation, that we're recognizing the importance of these species and we're adapting our behaviors in order to acknowledge that importance. So I'm interested in these. I want to know how do we get more of those and less of those? I think a lot of us are interested in that. Our first paper on the topic focused on large carnivores. And the reason being that large carnivores, you just get hit wildest spectrum of values towards these animals. It's like they're so iconic. Hello, mascot of a particular university. They're so iconic that the university uses that for an animal that lives halfway across the world, and that's everybody knows what a tiger is, even though many of us have never seen one. We certainly haven't seen one in the wild, for example. So they're very highly valued, very iconic, very symbolic, but they also are so darn risky for the world. There's a reason that we have worked hard to not let ourselves be impacted by these animals, because they're a threat to our safety and our well-being and our livelihoods. But through this review, the synthesis, we were struck by how many places people were sharing landscapes with these animals. Sometimes they were fraught with conflict. This isn't to say that these were all picture perfect, not by a long shot. But we were also struck by how much diversity there was in how the wildlife were responding to people, how the people were responding to these animals, how much it was changing through time. And so we really started to see shared ideas and properties across these places that seemed like they were predictive of positive coexistence outcomes. And we tried to condense that into a definition of coexistence. Okay, so this might be the most contentious slide, we'll see, but I'm ready for it, let's talk about it. So we define coexistence as, get ready, Islam, a dynamic but sustainable state in which humans and wildlife co-adapt to living and shared landscapes. Okay. So far, so good. Where human interactions with wildlife are governed by effective institutions that ensure long-term wildlife population persistence, social legitimacy, and tolerable levels of risk. It's a long sentence. There's a lot of qualifiers, but this is purposeful. For us, we think of coexistence as an aspiration. In a lot of ways, we think of it as like sustainability, sustainable use. There's very few examples where there is a perfect sustainable use, but sustainability has this aspirational element to it, and we're all trying to figure out how to work towards it. Similarly, we think of coexistence having multiple criteria. It's hard to achieve, but the big filter, the thing that was so important to us was its effective institutions. That everything has to filter through that. And when you had places where the institutions were effective, you had greater likelihood of self-sustaining populations of the species you cared about. You tended to have more social legitimacy. People trusted the management authorities, and that was crucial. And you had some conflict. There's never zero conflict, particularly with carnivores, but they were tolerable levels. What those are, what's tolerable, was that threshold. I'm hoping there's some emerging leadership here that's going to give you this. But crucially, going back, all of these are potentially measurable. I think there are variables and indicators that we could bring to bear that could fit into these categories and help us understand if coexistence is being achieved or if we're moving closer or farther away from it. What do other conservation practitioners think about this idea of coexistence? My colleague Michelle and I put together an online survey. We sent it to over 500 conservation practitioners, and we wanted to get their sense of what they thought were the problems, the solutions, the challenges to large carnivore conservation. And encouragingly, we found, well, by the way, the size of the circle, smaller circle means there's more consensus among the respondents. Bigger circle means there was greater variation around that mean. So smaller meant, more people basically agree with that particular statement. And encouragingly, we found that most respondents agree that human adaptation to carnivores is extremely important to achieving coexistence. And likewise, there has to be some acceptance of human carnivore conflict. So two of those criteria, it seems like the conservation community was likewise saying, yep, we see this in our particular study system, and we think it's really important. Less important was the requirement that carnivores adapted to people. Interesting to me, I think the reason for this is that the way that we characterize coexistence, the respondents are saying, look, it's not the responsibility of carnivores to adapt to us. This is a system where we have the volition and the ability to change our behavior. Probably unfair to say that coexistence is totally on their shoulders, I think. So John and I got together again, always a dangerous thing when John and I get together. And we started thinking to ourselves, I wonder if there are archetypes of human wildlife interactions. And if there are archetypes, that could be really useful because we could start to look at our particular system and say, are we in a certain archetype that we used to be in a different archetype? And are we moving to another state, another place in the system? And this is what we came up with. This is fluid, this is organic, it's been published, but I'm fully aware that there are probably all kinds of interesting little nuances and holes and pockets. So I'd love to hear from all of you about, the extent to which is it covering things, what are we missing? But this is what we came up with, 8 archetypes, and we have 4 different quadrants. And the quadrants are based on the level of adaptation by humans and wildlife, broadly defined. Adaptation being some kind of behavioral change with respect to the other parties. And so the purple ones are archetypes that we don't think are consistent with coexistence based on the definition I provided earlier. And the green ones we think are a little bit more consistent. And we even tried to shade them a little bit. These two we think are even closer to coexistence. These two are, still consistent, but we think they're not quite there yet. So I want to walk through these here for a minute. So we'll be on the slide for a second. The first that I want to focus on is this idea of zero-sum losers, where both wildlife and people are weakly adapting to each other. And in this case, we chose zero-sum losers because it means that wildlife lose whatever we gain. So it's a zero-sum game for wildlife in this case. And the example we came up with is amphibians. The amphibian decline in habitat is directly proportional to the expansion of human agricultural lands, by and large. So there's a very zero-sum relationship between wherever that happened, it came at the expense of amphibian habitats. Wildlife and the species declines are so tied to that. But also importantly, human actions and behaviors, they're not being modified to recognize the impacts on amphibians. In fact, in most cases where we thought about this, people weren't even aware of the impacts of these land use changes or human activities on these wildlife. They're completely overlooked. So in this case, amphibians are the losers in this zero-sum game. But these weak co-adaptation systems can reach a fragile stability. And examples here we have are some bat species. They can persist and do okay in urban areas, but their ability to behaviorally adapt to changes in those areas are limited. And importantly, their benefits and costs to the general public that live there are probably overlooked. People probably don't even know they're there. And if they do, they're probably only thinking about the costs and not thinking about all the other ecosystem benefits they might provide. And so you might see a case where, okay, there it's fragile. As long as nothing changes in this system, bats might make it. But you can imagine if there was a big shift in policy or the city grew or some zoning thing happened, they could have devastating consequences on bats. If we move up to this top corner where wildlife can strongly adapt to people, we have a situation I call tolerant synanthropy. And I think barn swallows are a great example. They thrive in urban and agricultural areas. Their actual fitness is higher in there than some of their wildland populations. And people generally tolerate them. They actually like barn swallows. They are harbingers of spring. There are all these things that people associate with them. But those synanthropic species can be more impactful and move into what we call a sporadic nuisance. There you go. Have to have a cute picture of the raccoon. An example here are common raccoons in North America. They can occasionally cause more significant impacts, and they're subjected to pest management, basically culling, because of the impacts of property and disease spread, and things like that. Their populations are okay. They're not, raccoons are not going anywhere, but they definitely, the impact can kind of pass that threshold of risk when we decide to do something and act and manage it. Moving down to the bottom right corner where people now can strongly adapt to wildlife. We have cases of eradication. That's clearly the farthest away from coexistence. Historical examples abound, usually around large carnivores, where historically we just went to every effort and pain to actively remove them from the landscape. But there's more current examples. Vultures right now are being removed indiscriminately across much of their range because they're vilified and because of their impacts and threats to agricultural production. So to me, this kind of falls into a situation where they cannot recover. That the collective action of removal is so strong and so powerful by people that these animals are suffering. But we can also mobilize. We can get together and mobilize and actually implement protection-oriented policies that are a strong adaptation because we're recognizing the importance of these species. And that moves into the archetype we call conservation alliance. An example I have here are tigers in South Asia. They're very sensitive to human impacts and disturbances. It takes concerted, sustained conservation actions, which is basically a form, in my mind, of adaptation. We've all agreed this is important to us. We want to keep these animals on the landscape. We have to do something together, collectively, keep them on the landscape. And finally, if you move in the top right category, where both wildlife and people strongly co-adapt to each other. Again, we have divergent outcomes. One being reciprocal damages. Good example here, common leopards. Famously able to behaviorally adapt to human modified landscapes. We're continuously being surprised by where they're finding them. They're like, here's a community of 1,000 people per square kilometer and like high rises. Oh, there's a leopard. And so they're extremely capable of living in some of these areas, but because of that, they have more frequent severe encounters with areas of high human populations. And in turn, those people are intensely persecuting leopards, and that's a threat to the populations of these species. But finally, we have sustained co-benefits, and this is sort of a holy grail. An example, albeit one of the few ones we can come up with, was deer. Deer do really well in agricultural landscapes, forestry, secondary forest, they do really well in those areas. Their numbers have boomed everywhere in the United States by and large. And for the most part, at a system level, people benefit from deer through hunting opportunities and viewing opportunities. Individual deer are killed, so there's kind of an interesting scale issue of welfare and how to figure out how to incorporate those into this. But at a system level, we view that as a sustained co-benefit. So they're both benefiting from each other. Okay, so the last point here is that when we look at these examples of these different archetypes, we realize that they're not random and they weren't haphazard and they were sticky, which by that meaning they didn't change all that often. They kind of sat there in one archetype for a while. And we started to toy with the idea that maybe there's an opportunity to bring in resilience theory to think about these archetypes. But resilience theory is a powerful concept used in the sustainability literature, thinking about complex interlinked systems and why they tend to stay in one place for so long. And I think that's what we're seeing here, that some of these are more resilient than others. And so to help us think about that, we can use a stability landscape. So they're a common conceptual tool to think about the stability of different systems. And the power here is that if resilience theory does map onto these archetypes, we can start to think about them in terms of how they vary by changes in social and ecological variables, how they relate to each other, how they change through time. And then most importantly to me, we might be able to get a sense of how to predict those changes and how to govern for those changes, if there is some sort of structure to those archetypes. So in this case, then we can think about an archetype as a football. First, maybe you've seen these kinds of diagrams before. And they're stable states because they sit in this little gravity well at the bottom of the trough. They can move the other archetypes, but they're fighting that uphill gradient. It's going to take some push in order to do that. Otherwise, they like to sit there in that stable state. And so you can imagine then that you envision this kind of conceptually, some of these archetypes are going to have a really deep well, and it's so hard to get them out of there. We hope that these are coexistence outcomes, but more often than not, they're archetypes that are not consistent with coexistence. Another way to look at it is in a two-dimensional frame, and this is more simple. We have archetypes, and we consider them to be stable, they kind of sit there for a while. And there are perturbations to the system, things that change externally, internally, that can push that system kind of up the uphill gradient to some extent. It's unstable because it wants to fall back into that well. And examples here that I was thinking about with coexistence are things like acute climate changes, like heat waves. Heat waves come in, and you see tons of examples where wildlife and people, for that period of time, totally change their behaviors because a very important limiting resource has become very limited. So here, for example, in Canada, heat wave, moose were coming out of the woodworks, literally, and going into people's lawns just to cool off and the sprinklers. Shooting photo, but if anyone's ever interacted with moose, you know this is a recipe for disaster. And this is happening all over these towns. And think of bears in Colorado, you have these changes to the system that perturbs the human-wildlife interactions. Is this enough of a perturbation that puts us into a different archetype? Maybe, maybe not. Another example I thought of was Cecil the lion. How many of you are familiar with Cecil the lion? Okay, good, yeah, good number of you. I won't get into the details, but kind of a hot, lots of media attention around this trophy killing of a famous lion. I think I consider that a perturbation to the system. It has such ramifications, changed policies. There were all these trade bans and changes to wildlife trade policies that directly emanated from the news media around this killing. And I think it probably had some ramifications on the ground and human-lion interactions and land uses. Now, those perturbations in resilience theory, they can grow strong enough, they can accumulate, and they can push that system to this threshold or tipping point, at which point the system will reorganize to a different archetype. And some classic examples of that are habitat fragmentation. There's lots of interesting literature on the nonlinear relationship. As habitat is fragmented, you have a linear relationship of conflict with wildlife until you reach a certain amount of habitat fragmentation. And then usually there is this huge escalation, a nonlinear jump in conflict with wildlife. And this has been repeated in places all over. Habitat fragmentation, linear, and then exponential. The one I'm really interested in are policies. At which point do we say, okay, stop the show, we are changing how we behave and interact with these animals? Because those to me function as tipping points. And a really interesting example is around racist attacks in the Indian state of Himachal Pradesh. In 2010, the impacts of these attacks on farmers grew so severe that the state allowed local people to legally kill macaques. The reason this is noteworthy is that the macaques have huge cultural and religious significance to these communities. Really, really important members of the community. Killing them indicates the huge shift in the social norm, whereas that the impacts are so severe that people had to struggle with this idea of viewing them as a manifestation of a deity to, I have a real livelihood I have to protect, and now we have to kill them. So that I think moved that archetype from sporadic nuisance, kind of sporadic annoying pest management thing, to reciprocal damages. Now we're locked in this entrenched system of negative interactions. Another way to think about this is, from the conservation and management standpoint, is if we know that they have resilience, how do we lessen the resilience of states that are not consistent with coexistence? And how do we make coexistent states more resilient so that we can have them stay in those places? And the way that sustainability literature thinks about this is endogenous changes. Things happening within the system that keeps accumulating and growing and changes the underlying resilience of the system. If we took that heat wave example, heat waves kept happening, you have a drought, and a drought is excessive enough, you have desertification. Desertification is such a fundamental underlying thing that would change the resource distribution, and you can imagine that altering the resilience of that system almost permanently, where wildlife and people now are struggling and competing over this once abundant resource is now almost permanently gone for exchange. Alternatively, the abandonment of farmlands in Europe, I think, is an interesting example of making a system less resilient in that now wildlife have opportunities to grow and expand in new areas that were once farmland and now abandoned, kind of following this idea of rewilding. It's wildly popular in Europe. And because of that expansion of wildlife, humans and wildlife will interact in totally different ways than they have interacted for potentially hundreds of years in these areas. So that system now is getting much closer to that cusp. It's much easier to switch into a new archetype theoretically. And then the example here I want to talk about is through time. Can we now look at archetypes through time, and does that give us some predictive ability into the future? And the example I'm going to walk through very quickly here are interactions between people and gray wolves in the American West. Lots of literature, lots of historical viewpoints about what happened. And I think we can look at the original archetype pretty squarely as eradication. There's lots of material out there about this, but suffice to say, a combination of fear, hatred, and government-sponsored bounty programs conspired to almost completely wipe out gray wolves from the contiguous United States. So that's eradication. There was concerted efforts directed towards those animals on purpose to remove them from the landscape. Again, I'm simplifying a lot here. I know it's very nuanced and there's all kinds of interesting elements here, but starting in the latter half of the 19th century, there was a growing environmental movement, changes to public sentiment, more favorable towards wildlife and wilderness in general. And that led to perturbations in the form of shifting norms, demands by the public to have policies that are more protective of these species and other species that were subjected to huge pest eradication programs. Eventually leading to what I think of as a threshold. We have the listing of wolves in 1974 as endangered on the endangered species list. There was other protective policies that enabled their reintroduction, their population growth, and expansion. And I think all of those form this tipping point, now moving the human wolf system to conservation reliance. Having wolves in the Northwest requires federal level protections and constant conflict mitigation, hence the reliance. Until just a few years ago, until many of those protections and mitigation efforts were removed. Okay, so now where are we? Well, in the last few years, as wolves have grown tremendously in these areas, there's been, of course, correspondingly more impacts on the livestock industry and game species. We're having a lot more human conflict in around the future of wolves in these areas. And to me, that kind of fits into this idea of perturbations, conservation reliance, and now the system is kind of getting, jiggled around a little bit through these human conflicts. So what about the future? And here I think there's some value utility of having these resilience ideas and conceptualizations, if we can start to figure out where are we going and why, and are there going to be simultaneous archetypes happening? So in Yellowstone, for example, we might see sustained co-benefits, right? People come from all over the world, will spend whatever, I was one of those, to see wild wolf packs in Yellowstone. And those activities support the park to create favorable conditions for wolves. And there's this nice feedback, people coming, seeing wolves, and wolves benefiting from the protection of their habitats. In contrast, in Idaho and Montana a couple of years ago, a number of factors kind of lined up, so the planets lined up, and there were policies, laws that were passed to allow professional hunters and trappers to remove 80 to 90% of wolves in those states using any means necessary. All terrain vehicles, snowmobiles, night vision goggles, baited tracks, whatever. Huge change from what had happened previously. To me, a lot of that has a lot of hallmarks of an eradication archetype. There is an intended result, which is effectively removing those animals. What I've tried to convey here is that this is resilient. We're falling back into this eradication archetype. And by being more resilient, it's harder to get it out of there. And then finally, in Oregon and Washington, where wolves are recolonizing in the last few years, we might see an archetype of reciprocal neighborships, where people who have not experienced impacts from wolves for a long time are not having livestock laws. Their trust in public institutions are being eroded. You might have this very entrenched, resilient archetype if there aren't any interventions there to get around that. So clearly, there's a lot of, I think, really exciting lines of inquiry if we think about this idea of archetypes and resilience. And I've talked about it as very kind of high-level thing. So many of you, myself included, are like, yeah, but let's get down to nitty-gritty. What are the variables that are influencing these archetypes? What's driving the system? What's most important and when? Do the socio-environmental influences change through time? Probably, but how so? What's the pattern? And is there a pattern that replicates in the different places? Is it social tolerance at first, and then shifting norms, and then protective policies, or can there be different pathways that influence the shifts? And I think potentially most important are tipping points. If tipping points are more prevalent than we think, this fundamentally changes how we manage these systems, because you will have a sudden change, and you might be operating under a linear relationship, and overnight you can have a system switch to a different place. Are there early warning signs? Are there things that we could see that says, oh, this is an early warning of a threshold or a tipping point? That could be good if it's moving in a direction that we'd like as conservation scientists, or bad, are we moving toward eradication? What do we do now to kind of get at that? And then lastly, there's a lot of really great recommendations from the resilience and sustainability literature, I think, that apply well here. And the biggest one is adaptive capacity. You can't stop it. You can't stop conflict all the time. But what you can do is you can give people and wildlife tools to adapt to it in ways that optimizes their interests. So adaptive capacity has been published hugely in the sustainability literature. And I don't think it's that hard to extend the concept to enhancing co-adaptive capacity. So for example, protecting priority habitats, protecting dispersal corridors, climate refugia so they can adapt to future changes in the environment, limiting harvests of game species in order to buffer their populations from future uncertainties. These are all things that some of us do, but I think are opportunities for enhancing the adaptive capacity of wildlife. But simultaneously, we can also be thinking about ways that we can do that for human communities, providing ways for us to retain, relearn, and innovate new coexistence strategies so that we're constantly staying ahead of the curve and adapting to the future changes. And doing that can help reduce the cost of coexistence, distribute benefits from one place and put them to the communities that are experiencing the greatest costs. If a system archetype is entrenched in a state of eradication or something not consistent with coexistence, then we might have to think about transformative change. Big picture stuff. We're kind of moving to the big guns here. And this is the idea that you have to think about reorganizing the system across all these dimensions, ecological, economic, social, to kind of reshape, reorganize our relationships to nature and wildlife in particular. And there's been some really cool work on this topic around environmental conservation. There's just 3 dimensions I want to draw your attention to. The idea here is that even though this is a huge, huge idea, we really want to figure out what the leverage points are. Where are the key places where we could have a policy intervention, pull that lever, and switch the whole system? And what are those and how do we intervene in them? The first is the idea of reconnecting people to nature. We see so much interesting work about what happens to human psychology when they are separated for long periods of time from natural places, natural environments. What happens to human psychology when they get very short periods of engagement with natural environments, seeing wildlife, really interesting impacts there. And so, right, your connection to nature underpins your worldviews, which then leads to your behaviors and actions towards the environment, towards wildlife. Restructuring institutions is a big one that comes up over and over and over again to provide more public engagement. So this is the idea of providing more inclusive decision-making, getting those local communities into the table to talk about their concerns and actually have some influence on management decisions, creating ways of shifting incentives so that the communities that are experiencing the greatest costs are getting fair benefits and money, basically incentives of supporting conservation in these shared lands. And then finally, rethinking how knowledge is created and used. And the really great example here is thinking about how to integrate different knowledge systems, integrating the knowledge we have here in academics, with local knowledge, with indigenous knowledge, to think about innovative coexistence strategies to enhance the adaptive capacity of communities. Okay, so if you're looking at this and you're going, whoa, dude, these are big. This is a lot of stuff you just tasked me with. You're right. And that goes back to my last takeaway, which was resilient coexistence, it turns out, is hard. It's going to take dedicated resources, sustained actions, and political will. But I think, and I hope many of you agree with this, it's as urgent as ever. The stakes are high. And I think we need to make coexistence a real policy goal and put some resources behind it in order to do that. Thanks. That's all I have. Ladder.
I'll start it off. Go back to the slide with the barns fall, please.
Yeah.
Great talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we'll be talking about this, right?
Yeah.
We all know that urban landscapes are filters for certain species. So how does this take into account the different actual behavioral, ecological adaptations of individual species? Like the amphibians, bullfrogs are replacing the green frog, replacing many other species that are dependent on wetlands that aren't being built by people. Whereas they could permanent wetlands are replacing impermanent wetlands. Bullfrogs and other species like that, and overtake human dominated landscape. The same with birds.
Yeah.
I think there's a filter on bats as well. And jaguars and leopards see the same things in jaguars behaviorally that you would see in leopards. I don't think so. I'm sure. So how does it? I mean, when we see a species, we can't assume that it's that the birds are adapting. It's just some individual species are adapting, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, my first thought is when you're describing that, you have some losers and some winners.
Yeah.
And so one species of frog is the loser.
Yeah.
In the sense that it's not capable of adapting to the changes that we're inflicting on them. And these other species take advantage and exploit that. They might be falling into this category where they are taught, not only are they synanthropic, but because they don't cause any impacts, people are like, fine, it's fine if they want to move in. But I'm also wondering, if you're talking about it, if it's possible to scale up and think about taxing instead of individual species, and the extent to which some of these could apply to a group of species, assuming that their traits are similar enough that they are predictive of their ability to adapt to change in the landscape.
That's cool. And the whole problem with human domination that conservation biologists is more homogeneous, less diverse planet.
Right.
Doesn't seem we can do anything about it. Other than the great example that you have.
We got to reach. Fundamental.
Going back to sort of your topic on looking at like large carnivores
Yeah.
specifically, I'm curious how much you've dug into whether or not, poor communities or indigenous communities are more affected or more like facing that conflict more often, and how that affects shifting archetypes. If you're just looking at rural communities versus like, big cities.
Yeah, I choose two thoughts. One is, I think in some communities, really low income communities, the impacts in carnivores are on top of food insecurity, water insecurity, exposure to environmental hazards, other things. So it's lumped, they're already a vulnerable community that now has this new thing that they can't manage. There's all kinds of things. And so that, I think, basically gives them very limited adaptive capacity because they don't have the resources to adapt to this additional thing when they have more fundamental principles of dignity and healthy lifestyle that they have to deal with. And I think that those are places where you have opportunities for co-benefits, where you do have these interesting integrated conservation and development projects that say, if we can get better water sources and better structures that reduce risk, the hopeful byproduct is that you're going to have more favorable interactions with these animals. And then for more wealthy places, what we've seen is there's a relationship at a large scale. We have a paper a couple years ago in bioscience that Jeremy Bruscotter, a social psychologist at Ohio State, they're seeing these patterns of modernization, economic modernization. So access to education, overall income, and I think mechanization, agricultural mechanization are three kind of easy indicators. You see these relationships of countries that have greater value of those tend to have more positive attitudes towards wildlife. And the general hypothesis is, well, because we no longer have the risk associated with them. We can choose when we go to see wolves, we choose to go see grizzlies in conditions that we dictate versus, if you don't have that opportunity, you just kind of have to deal with it randomly as it is. So I think there the conflicts are human. It's more pragmatic. How do I actually mitigate this conflict? It's impacting my livelihood. And it's more about the human dimension, I think, in those kind of wealthy nations and actual impacts to well-being. Wrong landing. So I think basically they're very different. You're going to have very different trajectories in those conditions. That's a great question.
Go ahead.
Talking about coexistence, I think like cultural considerations obviously comes up in the community. So what extent the cultural considerations come into play in that coexistence part, and how can we integrate the traditional knowledge people have to be resilient in coexistence?
That's a great question. So the question is, how can you integrate community activities to develop coexistence strategies? And this is something we thought a lot about, and it comes down to this last bit about adaptive capacity, particularly innovating and creating. So, okay, I have a lot of slide transitions. You know, so here, one thing we're interested in, is I'll talk about a couple things. One is retaining. So a lot of these communities have tried and true strategies that work, but they may have forgotten because those animals have either moved and are no longer there, they were extirpated, 50 years ago, so they no longer have to use livestock guarding dogs, is a great example. Europe used those, all kinds of countries used to use those traditionally, but then when you don't have carnivores, you don't need livestock guarding dogs anymore. So for a generation or two, people forgot how to use that. There's opportunities to retain those, and I think that that's where you could do some great mining of local knowledge about how did you used to do this 50 years ago, and maybe we could actually take some of those, adopt them, co-opt them, and actually make it innovate to the current conditions. They're different than it was 100 years ago. And what I've seen from cases, at least in the American West, is that there's a lot of innovation being done when the communities themselves are given incentives to do it. So there's opportunity cost from leaving my ranch and sitting in a room for hours every month, talk about things. I just don't even want to do that. If I give you real incentives, financially or otherwise, to do this, you have examples, usually very small communities, come together, they coordinate, and they figure out what's really driving the problem, and they come up with solutions that as an outsider, you wouldn't have even thought of. So I think there's, basically answer your question, I personally think it is actually bottom-up driven, and it should be bottom-up driven, because that local context, so specific, has its own path dependence of history, that you should mine those knowledge to figure out a creative solution. I can't imagine a top-down solution that will fit every one of these local contexts. You could try, I think it would be a horrible mistake. Let's just fence everything. One megafence.
So we had a great conversation last night about coexistence, and you have really changed my perspective, so I appreciate that.
Yes.
I'm thinking back to the Peterson paper, 2010, re-articulating the myth of human wildlife conflict. And the idea that there really is no such thing as a human wildlife conflict, or if it does exist, it's very rare.
Yeah.
In your archetype figure, I'm really wondering if or how the idea of the human conflict comes into play there, because you're really just talking about human wildlife conflicts with the goal of coexistence.
Yeah.
But as we lose more and more of our biodiversity, and in particular our large predators, the human conflict is going to come into play more and more often.
Yeah.
So how does that fit in? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I thought about it a lot.
I'm sure you have.
And that's why if you go back to the definition of coexistence, we actually listed effective institutions and social legitimacy. Effective institutions was first. And the effective institutions is a human process. It's effective by virtue of everyone coming together and saying it's effective. And to do that, you have social legitimacy. To have social legitimacy, you have to have a range of stuff, most notably trust and reciprocity and accountability, downward and upward. And so I think there's a lot of stuff that has to happen with the human context of how we interact with horizontally with our peers and colleagues and people in our identity group, and how we interact with managers and authorities. And if those things break down, that effectiveness breaks down, the social legitimacy breaks down. And that's why we have that baked in there, because so much of ecologists were like, well, it's just, are animals viable or not? I'm like, well, case in point, Norway. So John Lennon was Norway. Sweden has 300-400 wolves, if I'm wrong, don't correct me, and lots of wolves. And the shared border with Norway, now wolves come up, they cross over to Norway. There's this kind of classic source sink dynamic. Norway, years ago, in maybe typical Scandinavian fashion, got together all the stakeholder groups, and they reached a consensus that they were only going to allow 30 wolves, exactly 30 wolves in the country of Norway, which is not a self-sustaining population of wolves, but they valued and prioritized the human process of coming to agreement as a major win, big enough that they were willing to say, if wolves wouldn't make it in Norway if it wasn't for Sweden pumping the wolves over the border. And so it's like, well, we won, we did it. We finally got ranchers and environmental groups and everyone to finally put down their arms and agree, like, sure, we wolves. I mean, that's like coup packs. So, you know, there's a case where the human element did work. They got the institutions, you know, legitimacy, but you didn't have the self-sustaining population. And as a conservation biologist, I'm like, that needs to be there. That kind of, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think I'm just thinking more of like, in a figure, I mean, I love your archetype thing,
Oh, yeah.
it's great. But
Mhm.
how do you incorporate that human conflict into, because it's really, I love that it's human wildlife.
Yeah.
But how do you, what does it look like?
Yeah, I talk a little bit about the wolves and the perturbations to the system. The perturbations are human conflicts. They're kind of pushing that, and I think that's changing our ability to adapt. We're basically collectively, there's all these voices, and we're trying to figure out among all kinds of options of how we manage wolves, which one are gonna win out. And that's part of the adaptation process. And so whoever's talking the loudest, or has the most influence, unfortunately, is able to make some of those arguments go higher. But I think that's part of the human conflict that has to happen. We have to have that conversation. In the figures, yeah, I haven't done a good enough job. There were so many dimensions of the figure. I need a good visualized, graphically minded person to try to create like a multi-dimensional hypersphere with all these dimensions. I should put 2 axes.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm curious, in terms of how you develop these ideas, it seems to me that there's a lot of similarity with the Tannerty framework. And if you guys leaned on that while you're developing, particularly, it seems like there's a lot of similarity between and third stages from conservation to release that you're talking about. So I'm just curious, if you guys thought about this, and what you guys have looked at that very much, because I know it's part of the resilience literature.
Yes, a lot, and it influenced a lot of my ideas, but until you said it, I don't think I actually formally acknowledged how much it influenced my ideas. Yeah, I teach a class on cute wildlife and society, and our first few weeks are the foundations of social ecological systems. We talk to students about anarchy, the cycle, and kind of the embeddedness of these different cycles at higher levels and stuff. And I think I was trying to embed those ideas into this without bringing too much of their, I don't want to say jargon, but that's very Stockholm Resilience Center initiative. That's very much their area. And so, but I think I'm bringing in a lot of that in terms of the stability landscape. That there's almost inevitability of moving around there.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and you can see that. It continues to amaze me how often I see that framework show up in a lot of different systems.
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like we need to dig back into that because it ties back a little bit to Megan's question about almost like a trajectory. It's a trajectory starting from a lower income environment or a higher income environment. Are they on different parts of that panarchy where they've already had the release? You know, we're at a different part in the US because we had this tumultuous land use, land transformation, social shifting norms happen decades ago, and now we're having a reckoning. So we're in a different part of that.
Yeah, and there's just, you know, in that conservation stage that built up resistance to change, there's so much interconnection and invested capital.
Yeah.
That, you know, I was talking about that, even like culturally, you know, point like, well, what are we gonna do with these cats? So we're always built up enough capital that will be part of our cultural.
Yes.
So you can't do anything.
Right.
And so there's just always sort of the importance of the other boxes.
Yeah. That's great.
I'm gonna stop this there. We thank Dr. Carter again for coming. Students, lunch is in here. Yes. Bill and otherwise, yeah, thank you all for
And then